There are so many reasons to love Star Trek, but for me it's always the episodes that stay with me long after the credits roll. Episodes like the one I'm going to talk about today, from Star Trek The Next Generation's 5th season, called Ethics. The story follows the wake of an accident in a cargo bay that leaves Worf's spine irreparably damaged and permanently paralysed from the waist down. Facing the rest of his life with such a devastating injury, he instead opts to ask Riker to help him in a ritualistic suicide. And this is where the first of at least 3 clashes of ideas come into play, when Riker, deeply uncomfortable with the idea, discusses the matter with Captain Picard. Picard insists that even though Riker may not like the idea, he must respect Worf's beliefs.
You and I could learn to live with a disability like that, but not Worf. His life ended when those containers fell on him. Now, we don't have to agree with it, we don't have to understand it. But we do have to respect his beliefs.
This is the moral relativist's approach, that is typically summarised in the question, who are we to judge? Which, as I will revisit later, I think is actually a very strange position to hold. But Riker's struggle is a little deeper than that. As he points out, he's not merely being asked to respect the wishes of someone else from a different culture. He's being asked to participate in a ritualistic suicide of a friend.
I can respect his beliefs, but he is asking me to take an active part in his committing suicide.
Which then brings us to the second moral clash. Riker visits Worf in sickbay and does bring with him the ceremonial dagger, but reveals to Worf that he had done some research on the ritual and found that the role he had been asked to fulfill would normally be the place of the Klingon's eldest son, in this case meaning a young Alexander. Worf, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, rejects it on the basis that Alexander is in fact part human. So here we have Riker actually rejecting the relativist perspective and challenging Worf's views with his own. Yes, he has done some digging into the background of the ritual, but he's now using that to remind Worf of the human perspective. The fact that he has responsibilities as a father, that he has friends who value him, and that his injuries, though debilitating, are not actually life-threatening. Riker makes it clear to Worf that if he wants to carry on with the ceremony, he's going to have to ask his son, knowing that Worf is almost certainly not going to do that. But what if he had? How would that then make Riker's decision to opt out look? Worf would still be dead, but now Alexander, a young boy and part human, not raised amongst Klingons, whose lasting memory of his father will have been in helping him kill himself. Riker was undoubtedly in an impossible position here. He could either assist in the suicide of a friend and colleague, wearing that burden for the rest of his life, whilst still around his now orphaned son, his friends and his colleagues, or pass the buck back to Worf, who may still choose to involve his son, despite his initial reservations. Because if you think about it, Worf was poised to go through with the ceremony, whilst refusing visits from Alexander, so he would have died without having informed his son or given him the opportunity to say goodbye, clearly counting on Alexander to one day in the future understand his decision. Is it really such a stretch to believe that a man in his state of mind, poised to leave his son an orphan, might not take that extra step and finally ask for his son's participation? But as it turns out, there's actually a third option, the one that Worf eventually takes, which brings us to the third moral clash of the story, this one centering around the ethics of the medical treatment. Having found that there was very little research on Klingons with this extent of injury, due to the fact that they mostly kill themselves when left in that predicament, Dr. Crusher turns to a neurospecialist for help. As she soon discovers, Dr. Russell is not merely an expert in her field, but an experimentalist who is in the early stages of developing a promising new technology that could in theory restore Worf to full mobility by creating a new spine and surgically transplanting it. There's a red flag moment for Crusher when she finds Russell offering the treatment to Worf as a viable solution, concerned that Russell cares more for the immediate medical breakthrough than the care of the patient. Worf had been offered a conventional treatment that would allow him to regain much, if not most, of his mobility, but crucially not all of it, which he initially refuses before revisiting the decision following Riker's refusal to help him. but has collapsed to the floor from a standing position when finally receiving a visit from Alexander leaves him frustrated and angry, and back ready to die. In the meantime, the Enterprise has responded to a medical emergency, during which Crusher finds Russell having administered another experimental technology to a patient who has now died. Crusher, frustrated by Russell's failure to exhaust all conventional treatments before moving on to experimental ones, forbids Russell from practicing medicine further on the Enterprise.
Your research on this ship is over. You are relieved of all medical duties until further notice. Is that clear?
Beverly has looked further into Dr. Russell and found that she's been rejected from conducting human trials on many of her medicines several times. She believes that Russell is reckless in placing her desire to make scientific breakthroughs ahead of her immediate patient's care. Russell argues that the conventional treatments were inadequate and that the data she acquired will save so many more lives in the future. With this, we have two different views of medicine. One committed to making the safest possible decisions in the immediate short-term interests of the patient, versus the other who is taking the long-term view that there can be no progress without risk, and that a few deaths now may pave the way for a greater standard of care in the future. It's clearly a difficult balance to strike, for a profession filled with good people with good intentions, but also haunted by ghoulish figures, consumed by their own prestige or even malevolence, to whom patient care is an insensitive, distant priority. So after a conversation with Picard,
And this may not be good medicine, but for Worf, it may be his only choice.
Crusher eventually relents and assists Russell in her experimental procedure. A literal binary choice, everything or nothing. The procedure is eventually successful, but only due to the remarkable resilience of the Klingon body that has a backup for cognitive function after it initially appears that Worf has died on the operating table. It really is no accident that this episode is called Ethics. It stuffs a number of the most difficult to resolve moral dilemmas into a single script. A great example of Star Trek never ducking the hard stuff, and crucially knowing when not to be preachy, because there really aren't easy answers to many of these issues. Even the best physicians can't cure every ailment to the satisfaction of their patients. Some people really would rather die than live on in a debilitated fashion, even for their children. Frontier medical science is fraught with risk, and patient safety should always come first. But each of us may well owe our lives to some drug or some medical procedure we've had at some point in our lives that has some kind of dark and unethical past. It's all just laid out there for you to consider. But there is one last element left to consider, and that's revisiting the moral relativism that Picard presents earlier in the episode. Although I do think there's a very important element to this, that there comes a time where you must respect the decisions of others, even where you vehemently disagree. Moral relativism is far from the be-all and end-all it's often presented to be. Asking the question, who are we to judge, assumes we have no good answer. It assumes that if one culture values something more than, say, another culture values it, that these are two equally valid positions, on equal footing with simply a different perspective. There's nowhere to stand for us to say that one is superior to the other. But I actually think this is false. And one way to notice that is that the relativist position is a value itself. So who are the relativists to say that relativism is the superior position to take? The answer to the question of who are we to say is that we are the society that practices this specific belief, and we can point to the outcomes, and that's where the conversation really begins. Relativism can often get in the way and could prevent conversations with interesting outcomes. It's perfectly fine to have the courage of your convictions, to know what it is you value and why, and be able to make your case, just as I'm doing now.